this is the second time I failed to get all the way through the letter of 1 John. We're like 80% through, and that's going to be good enough. But it's a good, I think, good place for us to sort of pause, and this will inform sort of, it'll raise some questions and then sort of inform the ways that we respond to those questions throughout the season of Advent. But it's, I think, an appropriate place for us to summarize the entire letter tonight. This passage: God is love. Everyone who lives in love lives in God, and God in them. But before we get that, it begins like this. This is how we know that we live in God and God in us, which begs the question, why would someone write that? Very likely it's because somewhere along the way somebody asked, how do we know that we live in God and God in us? A good question. I want to start by naming the difference between a religious question and a mystical question. I think the former is concerned with being right, and the latter is concerned with an experience. And the reason I say mystical, we could also say contemplative, is that the question is not about elsewhere, otherwise, or outside reaching, finding, acquiring, or getting to God, what I would call religious questions, which assume that we are apart from and disconnected from God. In fact, the word religion, religio, is about reconnection. It assumes disconnection. Mysticism, on the other hand, contemplation, they're not about the binaries of connection and disconnection, as if those two states actually exist. Instead, they are about consciousness, which means that we know God. And so to know God, to experience life in God, God's life in you, is an inward journey. It's to discover something, as we've said all along, is already here. It's already in you. You're already fully connected, fully integrated, and you're invited to become more and more conscious of this truth, of this reality. Not to be right, not to get saved, not to avoid punishment, but to experience a sort of depth and density in life, a life that's harbored in the name of God. So, great question. This is how we know that we live in God and God in us. God has given us of the Spirit. So throughout the letter, we've heard this. We have the Spirit. This is an incredibly high view of human capacity. We have what Jesus had. We can do what Jesus did, and even more. We can live this kind of life that Jesus said was possible. But that's not all. It goes on. And we've seen and testified that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them, and they in God. And so we know and rely on the love that God has for us. So there's a lot of sort of moving stuff. This theme, though, comes up over and over in the letter of 1 John. They continually come back to this idea using family language, familial metaphors, that God is in relationship with Jesus, and Jesus in relationship with God, and God and Jesus in relationship with the Spirit, which is in relationship with both God and Jesus. And somehow, this tries to sort of boil it down and say, simply acknowledging that reality, that relatedness, you're participating in it. You enter into that relationship, that connection, that oneness, which Jesus prays the people who come after him will experience, that same oneness that he experiences with God. This is a very relational kind of knowledge, but it's still very abstract and heady. And so then it gets very practical. God is love. So if you're wondering what that God is, or what this relational unity thing is, this experiential oneness, the sacred kind of interconnectedness, this divine dance of giving and receiving and relating, it's almost like the author finally says, you know what, let's simplify this. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. So that's how we know love. And now I think we know what the author is talking about, because as we've all just shared around our tables, we know love. We've experienced love, right? Not the kind of thing we need to necessarily read about in a sacred text, because we know it personally, intimately. You've felt love. You've felt the absence of love. You've probably fallen in love and maybe out of love, and you've experienced the roller coaster of elation and disappointment, to love and not have that love reciprocated, to fall in love and suddenly experience a deep and inexplicable connection and oneness. This word love is agape. This is familial love. Spouse, parent, child, brother, sister. God is expressed in this relational reality between father and son, which begins to make more sense why that metaphor is so predominant. That's the metaphor that keeps being used. God is the name of agape, which is the kind of love in a family. We know that this relatedness that we call God lives in us, and we live in that relatedness because we participate in it. So we participate in that family, so to speak, by loving. The sacred relationality harbored in the name of God. Speaking of which, the name of God. when you first read this, it sort of seems like what the author is doing is naming God, and we have to admit that names matter. I was at Starbucks this week meeting with somebody, and I ordered my coffee, and I realized after about 10 minutes that they hadn't called me. And I walked up, and I was kind of miffed, and I recognized my order, and I grabbed it, and I sort of gave the lady a bit of a look. And she goes, "I've been calling you for 10 minutes." And I took both my coffee and my venti water, and I examined them, and they both were labeled Dan. And I learned that when somebody shouts a name that is not yours, you can entirely tune it out. I had no memory of hearing the name Dan called for 10 minutes. And it makes sense. Ben, Dan, one syllable, they end with the letter N. Okay, fine, fair enough. But then 10 minutes after that, clear as a bell, Ben. And I thought, I got him. They switched my order with Dan. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go hover and see if Dan got his order labeled Ben. So I walk up and there's nobody there, and she says it again, Ben. And I sort of look around and I'm like, I'm Ben, so there's nothing illegal going on here. And even though it wasn't my order, and I knew it wasn't my order, I'm like, I'm going to check this out. So I look, sure enough, it's Ben. And I turn around and there's a guy standing there and he goes, "That's mine, I'm Ben." And I thought, wait a minute, no you're not, you're Dan, right? In order for this to work the way that you've got to be Dan. And I found out there are more people named Ben than just me. So names matter. Kenny and I have been running into this guy that we went to college with, and he's called Kenny the wrong name, been corrected, called him the wrong name immediately, right after that, seen again on a social occasion, wrong name, and then one more time, 4 times. Calling Kenny the wrong name, like we can't figure it out, but Kenny's like, I'm done with this guy. The point is names matter. Names matter. The creation stories in the Bible, they include the story about naming. God allows humans to name the animals, and I don't think it's like naming them like Roscoe or Muffin or Oscar, but it's also probably not like bird, dog, lion, fish, elephant. Who knows what that means for people to name things, except to say it speaks to our deep human need to name. We encounter something and we need to know what to call it. We need to know where to place it. We need to sort of put that definition on it. We need to name things. So what is God's name? It turns out God has had many different names. El Shaddai, Elohim, Yahweh, I am, whatever that means. The list goes on. And I just want to play with this first one because I think this is fun. The oldest, this is in the story of the Exodus, it says Abraham calls God El Shaddai, which comes from a mix of El, which is actually a Canaanite deity, the chief god of the Canaanites, El. And here it actually functions a bit more as a title than a name. But then the second part is Shaddai, which is really kind of mysterious origins, but it probably comes closest to something like mountain. So, God of the mountain. Something like that. And it makes sense because Abram, in the story, he's told to sacrifice his son Isaac on a mountain, on Mount Moriah. He has this experience. Supposedly God interrupts the sacrifice. Really kind of a creepy story, but I'll talk on that sometime. But I think more so what it reminded me of is that on a purely human level, we stand at the foot of a mountain, or we stand at the top of a mountain, and we feel something. We feel something. This summer, Nate, who I think is not here tonight, right? Okay, well, Nate climbed 12 4,000-foot mountains in Maine, a total of I think he said 18 summits. Some amazing pictures. Would you be surprised to learn that he had a powerful, life-changing, what we might call a mystical experience? He was sharing with us this week at Occupy Trilogy. On Wednesday, he was on top of Mount Katahdin, and he said, I felt so small. Yeah, I felt so small. No surprise, his spiritual consciousness was awakened. It was stirred in the mountains. And what a compliment to you all. What he said is that in this community, right, he said he had all of these ideas, these thoughts, these sort of fleeting things, these feelings that he had on the mountain. And this was all before he started coming to the collective. And he said he came into this community and all that stuff has been validated, affirmed, reiterated, fleshed out, developed, nurtured. And he and his friend Laura are actually going to come and share next week. I think it's going to be great what collective means to them. And all of this to say, very often we don't actually name God objectively, right? Like based on science, like let's actually study this and find out what the name of God really is. No, we name God through our experience. Probably the way we name most things. So we're not actually naming God, we're naming our experience of God. So God of the mountain, for example. We have an experience and that becomes the thing that we think of as the name of God. So naming then is an icon. it's a thing that points past itself. A name becomes a reminder of our experience, right? And our experience sort of lives within that name. So what John is doing here with the letter of 1 John is not just naming God. Right? It's not saying that love is like a nice name for God, beyond which lies like actual God. God is love. The statement is beyond name. It is beyond form. He's saying God is love. He's speaking of the essence that is beyond name, that is beyond form. Whatever God is, beyond our names, beyond our forms, beyond all religious tradition, beyond all ritualistic conceptions, and those matter. Remember, names matter. That stuff matters. But beyond all of that is love. Contact with love is contact with God. Experience of love is experience of God. So love is beyond name. It is beyond form. We can actually even say it is beyond God, because God is a name. Rabindranath Tagore, which, by the way, if you're looking for baby names, Rabindranath, because unique is the new cool. Rabindranath Tagore says, love is the ultimate meaning of everything around us. It is not a mere sentiment. It is truth. It is the joy that is at the root of all creation. Root of all creation sounds like the ground of being, sounds like the understanding of God. This is love. And I want to pause here so that we don't sentimentalize love and sort of hold it at a distance. Love is relational. You cannot understand love without having an other to love, which makes sense. This whole Jesus, God, Spirit deal is actually pointing deeper than those characters. It's pointing beyond those names and those forms to the energy, the actual uniting energy of connection and belonging that we call love. And the idea is we get caught up, or we can get caught up in that relational reality, not as something we believe in, but rather as something we actually experience. Anyone ever experienced that sense of one? And I feel like we've talked a lot about it this last 3 or 4 months. That sense of oneness, that sense of connection with another person, not necessarily to just romantically, but where that sense of differentiation sort of melts away and you feel that connected, that you're like, I don't know where I end and this other person begins. Anyone ever had that experience? Right? When we're playing board games, we call it mind meld. Like, we know the answers. Sort of a paradox, right? There's like this unitive consciousness, relational oneness. How does that work? Because you have to have two people to be in relationship with one another, but then at the same time, that sort of dissolves, and all of a sudden, you're one. It's a paradox. I don't know. God, love. Now, this makes more sense, I think, when we remember that the word used for this love is agape, which is like a family. I was thinking about this. All the stuff that I was really worried about, like when we were pregnant with June and then Huck, I never worried about, like, how are we going to teach them to love us? Right? We didn't have to teach them to love us. No one had to teach us to love them. It was instinct, right? There's this kid there that wasn't there, and then you just love them. I didn't take a class, right? We didn't, once our kids were old enough, we're like, all right, time for love school, because you better love me the right way. No one taught me anything, and yet I would die for my kids. I would gladly give my life for my kids. And the question is, does that instinct extend beyond nuclear family, parent-child? Can it extend to others, aunts and uncles? Crazy cousin Persis? I actually asked Jim Kane to sort of weigh in from the sort of developmental psychology perspective, and he sent me a bunch of stuff. But this brilliant quote, 1932, Haldane set out the mathematics of kin selection, which I have no idea what that is, but there's this famous joke that goes with it. He says, I would willingly die for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. Apparently there is math related to like the exchange of how many people you can die for. So he gave me great resources on altruism and family development, and we're going to actually dive into those over the next few weeks. So if you want to take tonight's sermon, really the questions that it raises to a sort of further level, we'll do that together over the next couple weeks. But what about beyond family? Sort of look and you go, okay, yeah, maybe within like a tribe. And then the question is, well, how big can the tribe get before that instinct sort of the instinct gives way to self-preservation, right? The love instinct goes so far, and then it's like every man for himself. And then the bigger question, Can that instinct extend beyond even the tribe? This is a major theme that keeps coming up in the TV show The Walking Dead, and they're brilliant because they don't ever resolve it. They just keep naming it. Season after season, they just keep asking that question. Right? Can people care about each other, or is it just every man for himself? How far does love go? Until it just becomes about self-preservation again. And the crazy thing is, so we've heard stories about mothers lifting cars to save their kids, right? Or giving their lives to stand in between their kids and danger. But I started wondering about the stories where people run into burning buildings to save total strangers, like not firefighters, just like a person on the street. Like, oh, there's somebody in there that's like dying. I'm going to run into a burning building to help. Or people rushing into dangerous surf to rescue someone who's drowning. Total stranger. Something like this. He is drunk, by the way. Where does that come from? Let me ruin the sermon for you. I don't know. They don't cover that in seminary, ever. It almost seems like it activates that familial instinct, like almost an involuntary, biological, moral imperative. That wasn't a moral decision. That wasn't a rail worker consulting his religious convictions and going, save him, don't save him. Something happened. And the thing is, it could be, very often, the rescuer is a total mess. They're dishonest, they're cheating on their taxes, they're cheating on their wife. Something else takes over that's beyond sort of their moral makeup. And the way we know this is that if I saw someone drowning and I didn't go to their rescue for whatever reason, I've got lots of good reasons. I'm late for a meeting, and the earth is already overpopulated, and there's a good chance someone else will come along and rescue this person. You guys would think of me, you would judge me as morally corrupt. Wait a minute. I don't know this person. They're not in my family. See, I think when you dig in, there seems to be the subconscious moral, human, call it spiritual conviction that life is precious. All life is precious. That the person in the water, the person on the tracks are as important as me. They're a person also. That underneath all the familial and tribal identity, underneath all the partisan politics, underneath the illusion of gender binaries and the constructs of racial division, it seems somewhere deep down there is this core understanding of reality that we are all family. And that's, I hope, agape love. That it's not just for those in our nuclear family or for our tribe, but it's the love that sort of pulls back that curtain that shows us the reality that every single one is family. And this is the essence of God. Not just the feel-good love of holding my newborn son, but that self-sacrificial love that puts me in front of a train to push him out of the way without any hesitation, and then to ask even the stranger, even the enemy, how does that family instinct go beyond itself? Where does that come from? How does it work? Again, I don't know. I don't know. For thousands of years, people have thought of that as God. And I hope that is what is most true about reality. I don't know. I don't know. I can only tell you that's why I do this work. That's why I think us continuing to get together like this is important. Because I think when groups of people like ours, these schools of love, continue to pull back that curtain, to remind ourselves every week, to rehearse this kind of love, to practice unconditional belonging, willing self-sacrifice, I think over time it produces agape. I think it starts to extend that family instinct beyond itself. And granted, most of us don't have that experience, that intensity, the drama, but we can practice together. We can taste that unity, listening and responding to that human instinct, beyond name, beyond form, that calls us to see everyone as family, the dignity in each precious life. And the letter offers this one really practical thing. This is sort of where I want us to land tonight, that I think we can actually do, right? Because these are big ideas. And as I've said, I don't know how that works. So this is one thing I think we can do to cultivate it. And I think maybe it's much easier in those moments, like the action hero moments, because you hear people say things like, I wasn't even thinking, right? I just jumped over the tracks and pushed them out of the way. It wasn't like a conscious thought pattern. I'm going to say for us, I think it's probably much harder because I'm asking us to think. I'm asking us to choose to try to practice this one thing at least, which is facing our fears. Facing our fears. The text says there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear because it has to do with punishment. So first of all, this is sort of an aside. He seems to be saying that in love, that is to say in God, there is no punishment. There is no punishment to fear. There is no punishment to fear. Just let that sink in. Maybe hold that next to the modern Christian project. There is no punishment to fear. There's no punishment to fear. Do with that what you will. So if the goal is an experience of God, if it's to live this life that Jesus said was possible, if it is a kind of a formation in the way of love, sure, that's great that perfect love drives out fear, but we don't love perfectly. And so I wonder if we can reverse engineer this. Maybe we can get to love by facing our fears. And maybe a significant practice or form of life is just that ongoing audit of what we're afraid of, the self-awareness of where our fear is. What am I afraid of? And answer it, but then push past that. Is that really what I'm afraid of, or am I afraid of something behind that? And not just physical fear, like for your safety, but vulnerability, being exposed, being found out, being insecure. How does that fear prevent me from loving? Who does that fear prevent me from loving? And I want to soften this hyperbolic language a little bit, because I think this sounds very extreme. This isn't this dualistic light switch here. And it sounds that way, as if any fear means there is no love. And genuine love means there is no fear. I don't think that's how it works. I think this language is hyperbole. I think, in fact, it's more like a spectrum or a continuum. The more fear there is, the harder it is to love. And the more love there is, I think probably the less fear there tends to be. Again, maybe, I could be wrong. I think that's what this is getting at. So I'm in the home stretch of my hospice residency, and we recently, maybe 6 weeks ago, we picked up a new patient, and I got tapped for what's called an initial visit. So that means within 2 weeks, I have to go to this person's house and perform a psychosocial assessment. So during our next team meeting, about a week later, I learned that this 94-year-old patient, this woman is being cared for by her son, and I learned that he is mean. I think the doctor actually said he's an asshole, but the son is mean. He chased off the team doctor when he went for his first visit. He screamed at the social worker because she parked in the driveway. She should have known better. You only park on the grass. He was incredibly cold to the nurses, and I called later that day after the team meeting to schedule the initial visit, flat out declined. No chaplain. You can't speak to my mom. Like, okay. Interestingly, though, what we also learned is that he is an amazing caregiver. His mom at this point is skin and bone, and yet her skin was kept perfectly. This is really tough. With a patient that old who is non-ambulatory, you get bed sores, you get these little wounds, and it's really, really tough. And he was essentially carrying her back and forth to the bathroom, cleaning her up. And so we also learned just before she came on hospice care, he had this serious medical procedure in Jacksonville, and he was given 5 days of respite care, which means his mom had to go and stay in a home where she was cared for while he had this crazy surgery. So he gets done. He's released on day 3 rather than day 5. He immediately goes and gets mom because he wants her home. He wants to be the one giving her care. So we sort of had this moment where we realized as a team, this guy is devoted. He's loving. He's incredibly caring and supportive. But again, damn, he's so mean. He's so mean. And what we realized is he's terrified. He's terrified. We represent the death of his mom. And all of his efforts are trying to prop up this illusion that she's going to live, and she's not. And admitting through hospice that she's going to die has terrified him. And so it took me a few days, but I called back. He immediately declined. And I said, listen, I need to come by and check on your mom. I'm a part of an interdisciplinary care team. I'm required by my job. No, don't come. So I went. And he must have known, because as I pulled up in the grass, not the driveway, because there are rules, he's standing in the middle of the driveway with his arms crossed, and he's just shaking his head no. I'm like, oh my God, this is so crazy. So I walk up, I introduce myself, I put out my hand for the handshake, nothing. And at this point, I'm like wondering if he's breathing. This is the most stoic scowl I've ever seen in my life. I say, I know you're not interested in a chaplain visit. Again, your mom is the patient. She hasn't declined. I'm required by my job to check at least once. Nothing. Silence, just staring at me, daggers. He steps forward, very close to my face now, and he says, you're not coming in. All right. So I say, I've heard about the way that you care for your mom. Feeding her, giving her medicine, keeping her comfortable, carrying her, cleaning her. It's beautiful. I respect that so much. I know you don't like us being around. I know you're scared. But this is what we do. We're here to help you love and care for your mom as best we all can so that she can live these days the best she can. Nothing. Silence. We're still right looking at each other. And he takes a step back, just 1 foot, and I think he's going to hit me. I think like that's what it felt like. And he sort of like settles back in for a second. And he says, you're kind and good. And there aren't many good people left in the world. I can tell you mean well. Come in. So I don't think fear and love are actually mutually exclusive. I don't think it works that simply. We are complex, emotional beings. But I wonder if we can't risk moving through our fear, because I was terrified. He was afraid, but I was afraid. If we can move through fear to appeal to love, if we can make those connections to love that's there, because there's love there. With most people anyway, it's in there somewhere. If we can name and remind and amplify that love, then I think fear begins to move away. And by the way, she died this last week, and I am so proud of the way that our team cared for her, but more so the way we helped him to feel like he was able to care for her. And I wasn't able to go, but I heard at the funeral, he's like crying and hugging people, and he's hugging the doctor, and like all these people who were terrified of him. I got more, but it's getting late. Yeah, so what? Thank you, Bill. That's all I needed, just one. In some churches, they shout amen. If I can get a so what, I'll just keep going. So just very quickly, because this has also impacted me as I thought about this. It's Advent. We're talking about God or love being born. We're celebrating this in Jesus, but not only Jesus, the idea that everyone who loves is born of God. And this image of pregnancy has continued to kind of come up, and it does every year as I think about Advent. And since I'm a man, I want to say with absolute humility, these are my observations and anecdotal recollections, not my experience. So women, moms, feel free to correct me. After the initial finding out that you're pregnant, elation if you're trying, maybe horror or surprise if you're not. After that initial reaction, as you begin to process what's happening, I remember there very early on being some fear for Stacy at times about like the pain, right? Like this is something that the human body should not be able to endure. But women are more than mere mortals, and so they do it, and many actually choose to do it again. But I think if you consult anyone that's been pregnant, they would admit there's fear. Just, if nothing else, the unknown, like what's about to happen. And then I think for both of us, we kind of cycled through, especially with June, this fear of having no idea what we're doing. Almost like the moving thing. You have no idea what you've gotten into. Fear about being bad parents, like how bad are we going to screw this kid up, and then can we undo it? And the horror of raising children in this world. Like this was before the most recent election cycle, but we were still scared. And yet, people have kids all the time. Right? It's terrifying to think about the potential horror of kids, and people do it. Love somehow overcomes that. I was at Trilogy. Nate sort of interjected this. He said, and I think he's an integrative health major or something. He said, hope and fear, excitement and anxiety are controlled anatomically by the hormone norepinephrine. The physiological response to both are the same. So he said, it is up to us to frame the situation the way we want. Do we frame what is an anatomical reaction? Do we frame it hopefully or fearfully? And so I think in the season of Advent, a season of hope and fear, or preparing for love to be born, this is one where we're invited to frame our lives by hope or by love. And I couldn't shake this image. I think Advent at its best is about learning to become a community of pregnant midwives. Sort of a funny image when you think about it, but I mean, talk about a school of love. For each of us to think of ourselves as pregnant with love, and that everyone around us is also. And it's our job as a school of love to be midwives for each other, to be helping, coaching, walking beside, breathing with, providing solidarity as everyone around us bears love into the world. And then we also have to accept that same care and that same support so that we can find out what it means for us to carry love to term. Which, by the way, I think fear and hate are the miscarriage of love. These are the things that prevent love from being born in the world. And so love, I think, is both what allows us to overcome fear. It's also what allows us to risk the vulnerability required to bring love into the world. It's what empowers us to do the impossibly hard work of labor. I think it's funny that the season has become what it is. The birth of love is not wrapping paper and twinkle lights. It's not hot cocoa and candy canes and Bing Crosby. The birth of love is blood and pain. It's sweat and tears, and it's worth it. It's worth it. It's worth overcoming whatever the fears are associated with it. Because I think when we labor through that, we get to say the answer to that question, is love alive? Yes. Yes. If we can get through the fear. Brian McLaren uses this phrase, to suffer beautifully. And I think love is that, both that which inspires us to suffer beautifully and also the result of that beautiful suffering. And that's the symbol we return to every week, this icon, the bread and the wine, the beautiful suffering from birth to death, beyond which, not the bread and the wine themselves, beyond which lie the essence, love. A body broken, blood shed, the self-sacrificial love that reminds us that the human instinct to self-sacrifice for the other, that is real. That is love. And that the curtain has been pulled back and the reality has been revealed in which we are all family. The table of this self-sacrificial love, the table of the love of beautiful suffering, which bears love into the world. Even though we're not sure how or why it works, we're convinced it is the way to unconditional life. And we are committed again to practicing it. It's the table of that love, which has been set for us tonight, a table where we are all family. The table of this love is set for us and for all people. and no one will ever be turned away. If you'd like, you can come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.